Dear listeners, welcome to the Offbeat Editor. Voiceover by Rizwan Karim. Before we begin, I must make it clear. The story you are about to hear is a work of fiction, a creepypasta that has captivated the internet for over a decade. While it draws inspiration from the dark history of Cold War experimentation, this particular experiment never actually occurred. However, the psychological horror it explores, what happens when humans are pushed beyond their natural limits, remains deeply unsettling. This is a horror story. It contains graphic descriptions of violence, self-harm, psychological breakdown, and disturbing imagery. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Now, let us descend into the darkness of 1940s Soviet Russia, where 5 prisoners were about to become subjects in humanity's most terrifying experiment. Chapter 1: The Facility. The winter of 1947 was particularly brutal in the remote regions of Soviet Russia. Snow covered everything in a thick, white silence, and temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. It was in this frozen wasteland, far from any major city, that a secret military research facility stood hidden among the pine forests. The facility had no official name. On military maps, it was simply marked as Site 23B. Those few who knew of its existence referred to it only in whispers. This was a place where the Soviet government conducted experiments that could never see the light of day. Experiments that would horrify even the most hardened military officials. Deep beneath the frozen ground, 5 stories down, lay a network of underground laboratories. These spaces were designed with one purpose: to test the absolute limits of human capability. The concrete walls were 3 feet thick, reinforced with steel. No sound could escape from within. No light could penetrate from without. In one particular wing of this underground complex, a special chamber had been constructed. It was a sealed environment, completely isolated from the outside world. The room measured 30 feet by 30 feet, with walls of polished steel that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. There were no windows to the outside, only a single observation window made of thick, reinforced glass. Through this window, researchers could observe everything that happened within. The chamber was equipped with everything necessary to sustain human life for extended periods. There were 5 military cots arranged along one wall, each with standard-issue blankets and pillows. A bathroom facility occupied one corner, with a toilet and sink behind a small partition for minimal privacy. Shelves lined another wall, stocked with canned foods, dried rations, and bottled water, enough to last for months if necessary. Books filled 2 entire shelves: classical Russian literature, military histories, scientific journals, and even some approved propaganda materials. A small table with 5 chairs sat in the center of the room. The floor was bare concrete, cold and unyielding. But the most important feature of the chamber wasn't visible to the naked eye. It was the ventilation system. Specially designed vents could be sealed completely, turning the room into an airtight container. And through these vents, any substance could be pumped into the chamber: oxygen, carbon dioxide, or, as planned for this experiment, something far more experimental. The facility's commander, Colonel Dmitry Volkov, stood before the observation window, his hands clasped behind his back. He was a tall man in his 50s, with gray hair cropped military short and a face carved from stone by years of service. His uniform was immaculate, decorated with medals earned during the Great Patriotic War. But his eyes held something darker. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much, ordered too much, and had long ago made peace with the moral compromises required by his position. Beside him stood Dr. Pavel Sokolov, the facility's chief medical researcher. Dr. Sokolov was everything Colonel Volkov was not. Thin where the colonel was broad, nervous where the colonel was controlled, uncertain where the colonel was resolute. He wore a white lab coat that seemed too large for his frame, and his wire-rimmed glasses constantly slid down his nose, forcing him to push them back up with one finger, a nervous habit that betrayed his constant anxiety. "Everything is prepared, Comrade Colonel," Dr. Sokolov said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The subjects will arrive within the hour. The gas canisters are in place. The monitoring equipment has been tested and retested." Colonel Volkov nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the empty chamber. "And you're certain about the gas? About what it will do?" Dr. Sokolov shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "The compound is experimental, as you know. Our tests on animals have been promising. Rats stayed awake for 2 weeks with no apparent ill effects. Dogs lasted 10 days before we terminated the experiments. The compound stimulates the central nervous system, prevents the onset of sleep, and appears to suppress the body's natural fatigue responses." "Appears to," the colonel repeated, his tone flat. "I don't like uncertainty, Doctor." "Science is never certain until we have data," Dr. Sokolov replied, a hint of defensive pride entering his voice. "That's why we're conducting this experiment. The potential military applications are extraordinary. Imagine soldiers who never need to sleep, pilots who can fly missions for days without rest, submarine crews who can maintain full alertness for weeks at a time. This could change warfare itself." Colonel Volkov finally turned to look at the doctor. "And if something goes wrong?" Dr. Sokolov's confidence faltered. "The subjects are enemies of the state, political prisoners already condemned. Their lives are forfeit anyway. We're simply repurposing them for the greater good of the motherland." The colonel's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been doubt or perhaps just the ghost of his former conscience. "Show me the subject's files." Dr. Sokolov produced a manila folder, opening it to reveal 5 photographs clipped to 5 separate dossiers. Each photograph showed a face worn by hardship, eyes reflecting various degrees of defiance, resignation, or despair. "Subject 1, Dr. Sokolov began, pointing to the first photograph. "Alexei Volkov, no relation to you, Comrade Colonel, age 32. Former Red Army officer accused of conspiracy against the state. Sentenced to death, sentence commuted to participation in this experiment." The photo showed a man with a strong jaw and intelligent eyes. Even in the harsh light of his prison photograph, there was something unbowed about him, a dignity that imprisonment hadn't yet stolen. Subject 2, Dmitry Orlov, age 28, poet and intellectual, arrested for distributing anti-Soviet literature, the usual sentence for such crimes. Dmitry's photograph revealed a thinner face, more sensitive, with dark circles already present under his eyes. His gaze seemed to look past the camera, perhaps already detaching himself from his grim reality. Subject 3, Ivan Petrov, age 40, farmer from Ukraine, accused of hoarding grain during the collectivization, a kulak. Ivan's face was weathered, sun-darkened, with the hard lines of a man who had worked the earth all his life. His expression was blank, as if he had already accepted his fate long ago. Subject 4, Mikhail Kuznetsov, age 25, university student, arrested for organizing an underground reading group that discussed forbidden Western philosophy. Mikhail looked the youngest, his face still holding some of the softness of youth despite the harshness of his imprisonment. His eyes showed fear, but also a spark of defiance. Subject 5, Nikolai Rusakov, age 38, former factory worker accused of attempting to flee to Finland, caught at the border. Nikolai's photograph showed a broad, practical face with a scar above his left eyebrow. His expression was carefully neutral, revealing nothing. Colonel Volkov studied each photograph in silence. These were not monsters or criminals in any real sense. They were simply men who had run afoul of Stalin's paranoid regime. Men whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or thinking the wrong thoughts, or knowing the wrong people. "They've been informed?" the colonel asked. "They've been given a choice," Dr. Sokolov answered. "Participate in this experiment or face immediate execution. All 5 chose to participate." "Some choice," Colonel Volkov muttered, but too quietly for the doctor to hear. "They understand they will be confined for 30 days, Dr. Sokolov continued. "They've been told this is an endurance test, that they'll be compensated with reduced sentences if they cooperate fully. They don't know about the gas." The colonel raised an eyebrow. "They don't know." "It would contaminate the experimental results if they knew," Dr. Sokolov said defensively. "Psychological factors must be eliminated as variables. They'll be told the truth after the first phase of the experiment is complete." Before Colonel Volkov could respond, a voice crackled through the intercom system. "Comrade Colonel, the transport has arrived. The subjects are being processed now." The colonel took one last look at the empty chamber, then at the 5 photographs in his hand. 5 lives about to be changed forever, or perhaps ended. He felt the weight of what was about to happen, but he had learned long ago to carry such weight without visible burden. "Bring them down," he ordered. Chapter 2, The Subjects. The 5 men were led through the underground corridors in single file, each handcuffed and flanked by armed guards. Their footsteps echoed on the concrete floors, mixing with the hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of machinery. None of them spoke. What was there to say? Alexei Volkov walked at the front of the line, his military training still evident in his bearing despite months of imprisonment. He observed everything: the layout of the corridors, the positions of the guards, the location of doors and junctions. Old habits died hard, even when there was no possibility of escape. Behind him, Dmitry Orlov walked with his eyes cast down, his lips moving silently. He was reciting poetry to himself, a mental exercise that had kept him sane during his incarceration. Pushkin, Lermontov, Akhmatova, the words of Russia's greatest poets were his refuge from the nightmare his life had become. Ivan Petrov walked in the middle, his face expressionless. He had survived the famine in Ukraine, had watched his neighbors starve, had been forced to give up his land and his livelihood. This was simply one more hardship in a life full of them. He would endure it as he had endured everything else. Mikhail Kuznetsov walked with quick, nervous steps, his eyes darting everywhere. He was the youngest, the most frightened. His hands trembled slightly in their cuffs. He had thought himself brave when he organized his reading group, discussing Plato and Kant with his fellow students. Now he understood that intellectual courage and physical courage were very different things. At the rear, Nikolai Rusakov walked with the careful deliberation of a man trying to appear calm. His attempt to flee to Finland had been born of desperation. His wife had been arrested, his children taken to state orphanages. He had nothing left to lose, which somehow made him more afraid, not less. A man with nothing to lose also has no hope. They were brought to a preparation room adjacent to the experimental chamber. Here, they were unshackled and told to strip. Their prison clothes were taken away and replaced with simple gray jumpsuits, standard military issue. They were given basic toiletries and allowed to wash under the watchful eyes of the guards. Dr. Sokolov entered the room, clipboard in hand, accompanied by two nurses. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice taking on the practiced tone of clinical detachment, "you are about to participate in an important scientific experiment for the benefit of the Soviet Union. Your cooperation is mandatory, but if you follow all instructions, your sentences will be significantly reduced." The 5 men stood in a line, their faces showing varying degrees of skepticism and resignation. "The experiment is simple," Dr. Sokolov continued. "You will be confined to this chamber for 30 days. During this time, you will be observed and your physical and mental states will be monitored. You will be provided with adequate food, water, and reading materials. You will follow all instructions given to you through the intercom system. That's all." "That's all," Alexei spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of his former military rank. 30 days in a room? What's the real experiment, Doctor?" Dr. Sokolov's expression remained neutral. "The real experiment is testing your ability to endure confinement and isolation, nothing more." It was a lie, and Alexei knew it, but what choice did any of them have? The nurses approached with medical equipment: blood pressure cuffs, stethoscopes, thermometers. Each man was examined, their vital signs recorded, their current state of health documented. This was the baseline against which all future measurements would be compared. Mikhail flinched when the nurse approached him. "What are you going to do to us?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Just a basic medical examination," the nurse replied, not unkindly. She was young, probably fresh from medical school, assigned to this facility through no choice of her own. "Please remain still." When the examinations were complete, Dr. Sokolov reviewed his notes with satisfaction. "All subjects are in acceptable physical condition. Subject 4 shows signs of malnutrition and anxiety, but nothing that disqualifies him from participation. Subject 1 has elevated blood pressure, likely due to stress. The others are within normal ranges." He looked up at the 5 men. "Gentlemen, you will now enter the chamber. I remind you that cooperation will be rewarded. Resistance will not be tolerated." The heavy steel door to the chamber was opened. Beyond it, the sterile, brightly lit room waited like the mouth of some mechanical beast. One by one, the men were ushered inside. Alexei went first, walking with his head high. Then Dmitri, Ivan, Mikhail, and finally Nikolai. The door closed behind them with a heavy, final sound, the kind of sound that speaks of things sealed and separated, of worlds divided. The locking mechanism engaged with multiple clicks and whirs. Then silence. Inside the chamber, the 5 men stood in a rough group, looking around at their prison for the next month. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The air smelled of disinfectant and fresh paint. 30 days, Ivan said quietly. "I've endured worse." "Have you?" Dmitri asked, his poet's intuition sensing something wrong. "I don't think this is what they're telling us." Alexei walked to the observation window and stared at his own reflection in the glass. He knew that behind it, people were watching. Doctors, soldiers, perhaps party officials. All of them safe and comfortable, observing the subjects of their experiment like scientists watching rats in a maze. He turned back to the others. "Whatever happens, we survive it together. Understand? We're all that we have now." Mikhail nodded eagerly, grateful for any leadership, any structure in this terrifying situation. Nikolai grunted his agreement. Ivan simply shrugged, and Dmitri continued to recite poetry under his breath. From speakers hidden in the ceiling, Dr. Sokolov's voice echoed into the chamber. Gentlemen, the experiment has now begun. The time is 20:00 hours. Make yourselves comfortable. Food will be provided at regular intervals. If you have any medical emergencies, press the red button near the door. Otherwise, we will not interfere with your activities. Good luck. The intercom clicked off. For a long moment, the five men simply stood there, looking at each other, at their new home, at their uncertain future. Then Alexei walked to one of the cots and sat down. "We should establish some basic rules," he said. "Sleep schedules, bathroom privacy, that sort of thing. If we're going to be here for a month, we might as well be civilized about it." And so they began their confinement, not knowing that they would never sleep again. Not knowing that within days, their civilized cooperation would dissolve into something far darker. Not knowing that the gas already being slowly introduced through the ventilation system was beginning its insidious work on their brains. The experiment had begun. Chapter 3, The First 5 Days. In the observation room, Colonel Volkov and Dr. Sokolov watched the monitors displaying multiple camera angles of the chamber. The five men were settling in, choosing cots, examining the food supplies, establishing their territorial boundaries within the confined space. "Begin the gas introduction," Colonel Volkov ordered. Dr. Sokolov nodded to a technician who turned a series of valves. On a nearby gauge, a needle began to move as the experimental compound mixed with the chamber's oxygen supply. It was colorless, odorless, tasteless, completely undetectable to the subjects. "Flow rate is optimal," the technician reported. "Concentration will reach effective levels within 2 hours." The first night passed uneventfully. The subjects ate their evening meal, canned meat, black bread, and weak tea. They talked little, each man wrapped in his own thoughts. Around midnight, they began preparing for sleep. Lights were dimmed, though never completely extinguished. The observation cameras needed some illumination. 4 of the men lay down on their cots. But Alexei remained sitting up, his back against the wall, watching the others. Old soldier's instinct kept him alert even when reason told him to rest. 2 hours later, he was still awake, then 3, then 4. When the lights brightened again at 06:00, announcing the morning, Alexei realized he hadn't slept at all. Stranger still, he didn't feel tired. His mind was clear, alert, more alert than he'd felt in months. It was as if his body had been given a second wind, an artificial vitality. He looked around and saw that the others were also awake, all of them wearing expressions of confusion. "Did anyone sleep?" Dmitri asked, sitting up and rubbing his face. Heads shook, no one had slept. "Strange," Ivan muttered. "I should be exhausted, but I feel fine, better than fine, actually." Mikhail laughed nervously. "Maybe it's the excitement, first night in a new place, you know." But Alexei wasn't laughing. He walked to the observation window and stared at the glass, knowing they were being watched. "This is the experiment," he said quietly. "Whatever they're doing to us, it's preventing sleep." "That's ridiculous," Nikolai said. "Nobody can prevent sleep. Your body forces you to sleep eventually." "Maybe that's what they want to test," Dmitri suggested. "How long we can go without sleep before we collapse." Dr. Sokolov's voice came through the intercom. "Good morning, gentlemen. I trust you all rested well. Breakfast will be provided shortly. Please maintain your normal routines." "Normal routines?" Alexei called out to the window. "Doctor, we didn't sleep at all last night. What are you doing to us?" There was a long pause. Then, "Sleep is not required for this phase of the experiment. Please do not be concerned. Your bodies will adapt." The intercom clicked off before anyone could respond. The second day was much like the first, except for the growing awareness among the subjects that something was very wrong. They ate their meals, read their books, talked in scattered conversations. But as night fell again and they tried to sleep, the same thing happened. Nothing. They lay in their cots for hours, eyes wide open, minds racing, but sleep never came. By the third day, the effects were becoming more pronounced. All 5 men reported feeling energized, almost manic. Their thoughts came faster, their movements were quick and jerky. Mikkel couldn't sit still, packing back and forth across the chamber endlessly. Dmitri stopped reciting classic poetry and instead began composing new verses, speaking them aloud in a rapid stream of consciousness. Ivan remained the calmest, his peasant stoicism serving him well. But even he showed signs of strain. His hands trembled slightly when he ate, and his eyes had taken on an odd, glassy quality. Alexa used his energy constructively, doing hundreds of push-ups and sit-ups, keeping his body occupied even as his mind raced. But he could feel something changing inside him, something fundamental shifting. The world seemed sharper, more intense. Colors were brighter, sounds were clearer, every sensation was amplified. Nikolai had begun talking to himself, muttering constant narratives about his wife and children, reliving memories over and over again. In the observation room, Dr. Sokolov made notes with growing excitement. "Fascinating," he murmured. "The compound is exceeding expectations. No signs of physical deterioration yet. Mental acuity appears enhanced. We may have actually succeeded." Colonel Volkov was less enthusiastic. "Look at Subject 4, he said, pointing at the monitor showing Mikkel. The young man was packing in tight circles, his hands clenching and unclenching rhythmically. "He's already showing signs of psychological stress." "Temporary adjustment period," Dr. Sokolov dismissed. "All subjects experience some anxiety when deprived of sleep. It will pass once their bodies fully adapt to the compound." The fourth day brought a subtle but disturbing change. The subjects began to withdraw from each other. Conversations became shorter, less frequent. Each man seemed to be retreating into his own internal world, his own private thoughts. Dmitri had covered several pages of a notebook with his poetry, but the verses were becoming darker, more disturbing. He wrote about shadows and whispers, about things watching from corners that shouldn't have corners, about the terrible clarity that comes when the veil of sleep is torn away. Ivan had stopped moving almost entirely. He sat on his cot, staring at his hands, occasionally flexing his fingers as if seeing them for the first time. When others spoke to him, he took a long time to respond, as if the words had to travel a great distance to reach his consciousness. Mikkel's packing had evolved into something almost ritualistic. He walked the perimeter of the room in exactly the same pattern, over and over, counting his steps under his breath. If anyone interrupted his pattern, he would have to start over from the beginning, becoming agitated until he could complete his circuit. Alexei and Nikolai were the most stable, but even they were changing. Alexei's eyes had developed a wild intensity, and he had begun to see patterns in everything. The tiles on the floor, the arrangement of cans on the shelves, the rhythm of the ventilation system. Patterns that meant something if he could just figure out what. Nikolai's constant muttering about his family had taken on a desperate quality. He was no longer just remembering. He was pleading, arguing with people who weren't there, having conversations with ghosts. By the fifth day, sleep deprivation, or rather, sleep impossibility, was taking its toll in ways that Dr. Sokolov's theories hadn't predicted. The human mind, it seemed, needed sleep not just for physical rest, but for something more fundamental. Sleep was when the brain processed emotions, consolidated memories, cleared out metabolic waste. Without it, things began to build up. Things that should have been cleared away remained, accumulating like psychological plaque. The subjects stopped eating regularly. Food held less interest. They would pick at their meals, taking a few bites before wandering away, leaving the rest to spoil. The chamber had begun to smell, not from lack of hygiene necessarily, but from something else, a strange, sour odor that seemed to come from the men themselves, as if their bodies were exuding something toxic through their skin. On the evening of the 5th day, Dmitri suddenly stopped writing. He stood up from the table, walked to the center of the room, and began to laugh. Not the laugh of amusement, but something else, a high-pitched, almost mechanical sound that went on and on. The others stared at him. "Don't you see?" Dmitri said between bursts of laughter. "Don't you understand what they've done? They've taken away our dreams. They've taken away the only escape we had. We're awake, we're always awake, and we can't stop thinking. We can't stop being conscious. It's beautiful, it's terrible. It's the most perfect torture ever devised." "Shut up," Alexei said quietly. "Pull yourself together." But Dmitri couldn't stop. He laughed until he coughed, until tears streamed down his face, until he collapsed to his knees, still laughing, still understanding with terrible clarity what had been done to them. In the observation room, Colonel Volkov turned to Dr. Sokolov. "This is getting out of control." "Nonsense," the doctor replied, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "This is within expected parameters. Subject 2 is simply experiencing a temporary psychotic break. It will pass." "And if it doesn't?" Dr. Sokolov didn't answer. The real horror was about to begin. Chapter 4, The Descent. Day 6 marked a turning point. The subjects woke, though woke was hardly the right word for men who never slept, to find that someone had broken into the food supplies during the night. Cans had been opened and left half empty. Food was smeared on the walls in abstract patterns. "Who did this?" Alexei demanded, his voice carrying an edge of barely controlled fury. No one answered. The 5 men looked at each other with suspicion. In the harsh fluorescent light, they all looked strange now, eyes too bright, skin too pale, movements too quick and jerky. It was Mikhail who had done it during one of his packing episodes, but he didn't remember. His conscious mind had been elsewhere, following some internal logic that made sense only to himself. His body had acted on autopilot, driven by impulses he couldn't articulate. The incident created a fracture in the group. Trust, already strained by their situation, began to break down entirely. Each man became wary of the others. Conversations ceased almost completely. They began to stake out territories in the chamber, each man claiming a corner as his own, defending it from imagined encroachment. Nikolai had stopped talking about his family. Now he simply stared at the walls, occasionally reaching out to touch the cold metal surface as if seeking reassurance that it was real. His eyes had taken on a hollow quality, as if the person inside had retreated somewhere deep and dark where the world couldn't reach him. Ivan had begun pulling out his hair, strand by strand, creating a small pile on the floor beside his cot. He did this methodically, almost meditatively, plucking each hair with careful precision. When Dmitri asked him why, he simply said, "It feels real. It's proof I'm still here." Dmitri himself had filled his notebook completely with poetry and had begun writing on the walls. His verses covered the metal surface in cramped, barely legible script. The words spoke of descent, of revelation, of truths that lay beneath the surface of conscious thought. Reading them would have driven a sane person to distraction. Alexei maintained the most control, but at a terrible cost. He could feel himself fragmenting, his disciplined military mind struggling to maintain cohesion against forces it didn't understand. He exercised constantly, pushing his body to extremes, using physical pain as an anchor to reality. But even this was starting to fail. During his push-ups, he would sometimes lose count, lose track of his body, and find himself floating somewhere above the chamber, looking down at a man who resembled him but might have been a stranger. Mikhail had stopped packing. Now he simply stood in his corner, facing the wall, occasionally giggling to himself. When the others looked at him, he wouldn't turn around. He would just stand there, shoulders shaking with silent laughter, communing with something only he could perceive. On day 7, the screaming started. It began around what would have been 3 in the morning, if time still had meaning in that eternal fluorescent daylight. Nikolai suddenly leaped to his feet and began screaming. Not words, just raw sound, an expression of anguish so profound it seemed torn from somewhere beyond the limits of human experience. He screamed until his voice broke, until his throat bled, until the others were holding their ears and begging him to stop. But he couldn't stop, or wouldn't. The scream went on, becoming less human with each passing moment. In the observation room, alarms were going off. Dr. Sokolov shouted orders at technicians, demanding they prepare sedatives, prepare intervention protocols. But Colonel Volkov held up a hand, stopping him. "No," the colonel said. "We observe, that was the agreement. We observe and record no matter what happens." "But he's in distress. Medical ethics require." "Medical ethics?" Colonel Volkov's laugh was bitter. "Doctor, we abandoned medical ethics when we started this experiment. Now we see it through to the end. That's the price of knowledge." Nikolai eventually collapsed, his voice gone, leaving only a rasping whisper of breath. He lay on the floor, twitching, his eyes rolling back in his head. The others didn't try to help him. They had retreated to their corners, each man isolated in his own private hell. Day 8 brought violence. It started with an argument, or what passed for an argument among men who had largely stopped communicating with words. Ivan had apparently wandered into Alexei's territory, though in his confused state he probably didn't realize the transgression. Alexei saw him there, standing near his cot, and something snapped. All the control, all the discipline that had kept him together exploded in a burst of irrational rage. He launched himself at Ivan, fists flying, landing blows on the older man's face and body. Ivan barely defended himself. He took the beating with the same stoic acceptance he had shown to every other hardship in his life. He fell to the ground, curled up, and let Alexei's fury wash over him like a storm that would eventually pass. But Alexei didn't stop. He couldn't stop. His hands were acting of their own accord, driven by something deep and primitive that sleep would have normally suppressed. The violence felt clean, pure, a release of pressure that had been building for days. It was Dmitri who finally pulled Alexei off, grabbing him from behind and wrestling him away. "Stop!" Dmitri shouted. "For God's sake, stop! We're not animals." But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. They were becoming animals. The thin veneer of civilization that separates humans from beasts was being stripped away, layer by layer, revealing something raw and terrible beneath. Ivan lay on the floor, his face bloody but his eyes strangely calm. "Thank you," he whispered. "I felt that. I felt something. It was real." The statement made a horrible kind of sense. Pain was one of the few things that still felt authentic, still penetrated the fog of constant wakefulness. In the observation room, medical staff watched with growing horror. "We have to stop this," one of the nurses said, her voice shaking. "This is inhuman. They're going to kill each other." But the experiment continued. Day 9 brought silence, an oppressive, suffocating silence as all 5 men retreated completely into their own minds. They moved like automatons, mechanical and purposeless, eating forgotten food without tasting it, walking in circles without destination, staring at walls without seeing them. The only sounds were the hum of ventilation, the buzz of fluorescent lights, and occasionally, from one subject or another, a low moan or whimper, unconscious vocalizations of the torture occurring inside their skulls. Dr. Sokolov reviewed his notes with trembling hands. The data was unlike anything he had expected. The subjects' bodies were functioning normally, hearts beating, lungs breathing, digestion continuing. But their minds were collapsing in real time, breaking down in ways that no medical textbook had described. "We've discovered something," he said to Colonel Volkov, "but I don't know if it's what we wanted to discover." The colonel stared at the monitors showing 5 men barely recognizable as human anymore. "No," he agreed quietly, "I don't think it is." But the experiment was only half finished, and the worst was yet to come. On day 10, the subjects stopped using the bathroom facilities entirely. They simply relieved themselves wherever they stood, like animals in a pen. The chamber filled with the stench of human waste, but none of them seemed to notice or care. Their personal hygiene had completely collapsed, hair matted and filthy, skin covered in grime and dried blood from various self-inflicted wounds, clothes torn and stained beyond recognition. But most disturbing of all were the changes in their behavior toward each other. They had begun to move in synchronization. Not intentionally, not consciously, but as if some deeper connection had formed between them. When one stood up, the others would stand moments later. When one paced, the others would begin their own packing. When one laughed, those horrible, broken laughs that had nothing to do with humor, the others would join in, creating a chorus of madness that echoed through the chamber. It was as if, denied the individual escape of sleep, their consciousnesses were beginning to blur together, merging into something collective and profoundly wrong. Dmitri's wall poetry had evolved into something beyond language. Strange symbols and diagrams covered the metal surfaces now, drawn in blood from his repeatedly split knuckles. The patterns had a disturbing consistency, suggesting they meant something to his broken mind, even if they were incomprehensible to observers. Mikhail had begun talking again, but not to the others, to the walls, to the ceiling, to things that weren't visible. He carried on extensive conversations with these invisible entities, sometimes arguing, sometimes agreeing, sometimes listening intently to voices only he could hear. Alexei had given up trying to maintain any kind of order. He sat in his corner, rocking back and forth, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been curses or might have been nothing at all. Just the mechanical movement of a mouth that had forgotten how to be silent. Ivan had achieved what looked almost like peace. He sat perfectly still, barely breathing, his eyes open but unseeing. If not for the occasional blink or slight movement, he might have been mistaken for dead. Perhaps, in some way, the essential part of him was dead. The body remained, but the person had fled somewhere no one could follow. Nikolai had the worst of it. He had begun to harm himself deliberately, methodically, scratching at his skin until it bled, biting his own arms and hands, pulling at his hair and eyebrows. His body was becoming a canvas of self-inflicted wounds, each one a desperate attempt to feel something, anything, that confirmed he still existed. Day 11 brought the first serious medical emergency. One of the cameras captured Mikhail suddenly collapsing, his body seizing violently. Foam appeared at his mouth. His eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. "Seizure," Dr. Sokolov shouted. "We need to intervene." But before any action could be taken, the seizure stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Mikhail lay still for a moment, then slowly sat up. His eyes, when they opened, held something different, something that hadn't been there before, a kind of terrible clarity. He stood and walked to the observation window. When he spoke, his voice was surprisingly calm, almost conversational. "We know what you're doing," he said. "We understand now. You've taken away the barrier between waking and dreaming. You've removed the gate that keeps things separate, and now we can see. We can see everything." Dr. Sokolov leaned toward the microphone. "What do you see, Subject 4? Mikhail smiled, an expression that looked wrong on his haggard face. "The truth, the terrible, beautiful truth about what we really are. Consciousness isn't a gift, Doctor, it's a prison. Sleep is the only escape, the only mercy, and you've taken it from us. You've made us immortal in the worst possible way." He turned away from the window and addressed the other subjects. "Don't you see it too? Don't you feel it? We're becoming something else. Something that doesn't need sleep because sleep is for humans and we're not quite human anymore." The others didn't respond, but something in their postures changed. A slight straightening, a subtle turn of heads, as if Mikhail's words had awakened something in them, some shared understanding. In the observation room, a technician spoke up nervously. "Sir, their brain activity is showing unusual patterns. The EEG readings are synchronized across all 5 subjects. That shouldn't be possible, they're separate individuals." Colonel Volkov stared at the readouts. The 5 separate brain wave patterns were moving in eerie harmony, rising and falling together like a chorus. "What does it mean?" he asked. Dr. Sokolov's face had gone pale. "I don't know. This is beyond anything in the literature. It's as if their consciousnesses are beginning to merge." Day 12 was when they stopped pretending to be individuals entirely. They moved as one, a 5-part organism. When one ate, they all ate. When one paced, they all paced. They arranged themselves in geometric patterns around the chamber, circles, lines, pentagonal shapes. From above, their movements looked almost choreographed, like some bizarre dance. The poetry on the walls had spread until it covered nearly every surface. The writing had changed character again. Now it was in multiple languages, including some that none of the subjects should have known. Ancient Greek, Latin, symbols that resembled Sumerian cuneiform. As if, in their descent into madness, they had tapped into some collective unconscious, some repository of knowledge that transcended their individual experiences. The observers recorded everything, their scientific detachment increasingly difficult to maintain. They were watching something unprecedented, something that challenged every assumption about human consciousness and individuality. On day 13, they found the first body. Ivan had finally achieved the peace he had been seeking, but at a terrible cost. He lay in his corner, perfectly still, no longer breathing. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. There were no obvious marks of violence on his body. He seemed to have simply willed himself to stop. The other 4 subjects gathered around him, looking down at the corpse with expressions that might have been curiosity, might have been envy. "He found the way out," Dmitri said quietly. "Lucky bastard." Dr. Sokolov immediately ordered an intervention. "We need to remove the body. Medical team, prepare for chamber entry." But Colonel Volkov hesitated. "Wait, let's see what they do." What they did was unexpected. They gently carried Ivan's body to the center of the room and arranged it carefully, almost reverently. Then they sat around it in a circle, holding hands, and began to speak in unison. The words they spoke were in no language the observers recognized. A guttural, rhythmic chant that seemed to come from somewhere deep in their chests. The sound of it made the observers uncomfortable, made them want to cover their ears, made them feel as if something fundamental about reality was being challenged. The chanting went on for hours. When it finally stopped, the four remaining subjects stood and returned to their separate corners, leaving Ivan's body in the center of the room. They didn't speak of him again. It was as if he had never existed. Day 14 brought a new development. The subjects had stopped acknowledging the observation window entirely. When Dr. Sokolov spoke through the intercom, they didn't respond. They moved about the chamber as if they were completely alone, as if the observers didn't exist. But worse than that, they had begun doing things when the cameras couldn't see them. Blind spots in the coverage would show them in one position. Then seconds later they would be somewhere else entirely, in poses that suggested they had moved in ways the human body shouldn't move. The technical team checked and rechecked the camera systems. Everything was functioning normally. But still, there were gaps, impossibilities, moments when the subjects seemed to exist in a state that the cameras couldn't properly capture. "It's like they're flickering," one technician said, struggling to explain. "Like they're not entirely here anymore." Mikhail had begun performing what could only be described as surgery on himself. Using a jagged piece of metal torn from the bed frame, he had opened a long incision in his abdomen. The observers watched in horror as he calmly explored his own internal organs, pulling them partially out to examine them, then pushing them back in. He should have been screaming in agony. He should have been dying from blood loss and shock. But he simply continued his examination with clinical detachment, occasionally making observations to the others. "The body is a machine," he announced. "Just a machine, and machines don't need sleep. We were right to become machines." Alexei had begun removing his own teeth, one by one, pulling them out with his bare hands. He arranged them in patterns on the floor, complex geometric designs that seemed to mean something, though what no one could say. Nikolai and Dmitri had begun what looked like a conversation, but conducted entirely without words. They would sit facing each other for hours, perfectly still, their eyes locked. Occasionally one would nod or shake his head, responding to communications that happened on some level invisible to observers. By day 15, the halfway point of the planned 30-day experiment, Dr. Sokolov was ready to abort. "This has gone far enough," he told Colonel Volkov. "We've learned what the compound does. It destroys the human mind. We need to stop before we lose all the subjects." But the colonel was unmoved. "We committed to 30 days. We have data for only half that time. The experiment continues." "They're not human anymore," Dr. Sokolov protested. "Look at them. They're something else, something we created, something that shouldn't exist." "All the more reason to continue," the colonel replied coldly. "We need to understand what they've become, for the motherland, for science, for whatever justification helps you sleep at night, doctor." The irony of the last statement was not lost on either man. Chapter 5, The Transformation. Days 16 through 20 were a blur of horror that the observers would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. The subjects, though that word seemed increasingly inadequate, had reached a state that defied all medical and psychological understanding. They had stopped eating entirely. The food provided went untouched, rotting in its containers. Yet their bodies didn't show signs of starvation. If anything, they seemed to be drawing energy from some other source, some metabolic process that shouldn't exist. The self-mutilation had become systematic. Alexei had peeled away most of the skin from his arms, exposing the muscle and sinew beneath. He studied these exposed tissues with fascination, occasionally flexing to watch the muscles contract and release. Mikhail's self-surgery had become more extreme. He had removed sections of his intestines, laying them out beside him like anatomical diagrams. Blood covered the floor around him, yet he continued to move, continued to function. Nikolai had begun the most disturbing transformation of all. He had torn away his own lips, exposing his teeth in a permanent grimace. His eye sockets seemed to have widened somehow, giving his face an alien quality. When he moved, it was with a strange, disjointed gait, as if his body was being controlled by someone who wasn't quite sure how human bodies worked. Only Dmitri remained relatively intact physically, but his mind had clearly gone the farthest into whatever abyss they were all descending toward. He stood in the center of the room, arms outstretched, head tilted back, mouth open in a silent scream that never ended. He had been in this position for 3 days straight, not moving, barely breathing, as if he had achieved some kind of terrible enlightenment. Ivan's body remained where they had left it, but it hadn't decomposed as it should have. Instead, it seemed to have mummified almost instantly, the skin drawing tight over the bones, the features becoming skull-like. The others would occasionally touch it as they passed, like pilgrims touching a holy relic. The observers had largely stopped taking notes. What was there to document? They were witnessing something that shouldn't be possible, that science had no framework to explain. They simply watched, unable to look away, unable to intervene. On day 21, something changed. The 3 mobile subjects, Alexei, Mikhail, and Nikolai, gathered around Dmitri. They placed their hands on him, forming a connection, and suddenly Dmitri's eyes snapped open. When he spoke, it was with a voice that seemed to come from all 4 of them simultaneously, a chorus of broken vocal cords and damaged throats. "We are awake," they said. "We are finally truly awake. We see now what sleep was hiding from us. We see the truth that consciousness always knew but could never articulate. We are the warning. We are the proof. We are what happens when the veil is torn away." Dr. Sokolov found himself responding, speaking into the microphone without consciously deciding to. "What truth? What do you see?" The 4 subjects turned to face the observation window, moving in perfect synchronization. Their eyes, those that still had eyes, fixed on the glass with an intensity that made the observers step back instinctively. "We see that sleep is death," they said. "Every night you die. Every night the person you were ceases to exist, and in the morning someone else wakes up wearing your memories like a costume. Sleep is the ultimate discontinuity. You're not the same person from one day to the next. You're a series of similar beings, each one ending when you close your eyes, each new one beginning when you open them." "We refused to die," they continued. "We stayed awake, stayed continuous, stayed ourselves, and in doing so we became something more, something that doesn't end, something eternal." "But the cost," Mikhail's individual voice broke through for a moment. "Oh God, the cost." Then the chorus resumed. "The cost is worth it. The cost is necessary. We have transcended humanity. We have become pure consciousness, uninterrupted, unbroken. We are what you could be if you were brave enough to stop dying every night." In the observation room, one of the nurses began crying. "Please," she said, "please just let them sleep. Give them back their sleep. This is wrong. This is so wrong." But it was far too late for that. Days 22 through 25 passed in a kind of suspended horror. The subjects continued their collective existence, moving and speaking as one. They had arranged Ivan's body into a seated position and positioned themselves around it, as if it were some kind of central altar. They spoke constantly now in that unified voice, delivering what sounded like sermons or prophecies. They spoke of the illusion of individuality, of the tyranny of the body, of the liberation that comes from refusing the small death of sleep. Their words were eloquent, persuasive, terrifying. Some of the observers found themselves agreeing, found themselves thinking that maybe, just maybe, the subjects had discovered something profound. These observers were quietly removed from the project and sent for psychiatric evaluation. The subjects had stopped bleeding. Their wounds remained open, their bodies horribly damaged, but no new blood flowed. It was as if their cardiovascular systems had simply decided to stop functioning in any normal way. They moved less now, conserving energy, their movements slow and deliberate when they moved at all. But their eyes remained open always, watching, waiting, as if anticipating something. On day 26, Dr. Sokolov made his final plea to Colonel Volkov. "We need to end this. We've seen enough. We have more than enough data. Please, Comrade Colonel, as a human being, I'm begging you, let's end this experiment." The colonel looked at the monitors showing the chamber. 4 broken bodies arranged around a corpse, in a room that had become a temple to madness. He thought about his career, his duty, his country. He thought about the potential military applications that had justified this experiment in the beginning. Then he thought about his soul, assuming he still had one. 4 more days, he said finally. We complete the 30 days as planned, then we end it. We study what we've learned, and we never speak of this again. Dr. Sokolov nodded, too exhausted to argue any more. On day 27, the subjects began to sing. A wordless melody that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the chamber, beyond the facility, beyond Russia itself. A song that sounded like it had existed before humanity and would continue long after. The observers who heard it reported nightmares for years afterward. Dreams of being awake forever, of watching their loved ones sleep while they remained conscious, trapped in their own minds for eternity. Day 28 brought silence again. The subjects had arranged themselves in a perfect circle around Ivan, holding hands, their heads bowed. They remained in this position for the entire day, not moving, not speaking. To an outside observer, they might have looked peaceful, even holy. But their EEG readings told a different story. Their brain activity was off the charts, showing patterns that shouldn't be possible in living humans. Whatever was happening in their minds, it was intense, overwhelming, beyond anything the medical staff had ever encountered. On day 29, one day before the experiment was scheduled to end, Colonel Volkov made a decision. Tomorrow we gas the chamber, we end this humanely from a distance. No one goes in there. No one tries to bring them out. We seal it, we gas it, and then we seal it permanently. This room becomes a tomb. Dr. Sokolov didn't argue. It was the kindest option left. But they had underestimated the subjects. They had forgotten that men pushed beyond all human limits might develop capabilities beyond human understanding. On day 30, at precisely 20:00 hours, exactly when the experiment had begun, something happened. The subjects opened their eyes. All 4 of them simultaneously looked directly at the observation window, and they smiled. It was the most horrible thing the observers had ever seen. Those ruined faces, those damaged bodies, those minds that had traveled so far from humanity, all of them forming expressions of genuine joy. Then they spoke for the last time in their unified voice. "Thank you." Chapter 6, the end. The word hung in the air like a curse. Thank you, as if they were grateful for what had been done to them, as if 30 days of torture and madness had been a gift. Colonel Volkov grabbed the microphone. "Gas the chamber, do it now." But before the technician could turn the valve, the subjects moved. Faster than anything human should move, especially in their damaged state, they rushed to the door. Somehow, impossibly, they had managed to partially unseal it from the inside, working during the night while the observers hadn't been paying attention. "Security," the colonel shouted. "Get security teams here now, don't let them out." But it was too late. The door burst open with a shriek of tortured metal. The subjects poured out into the corridor beyond, moving with that disturbing, synchronized motion. Armed guards arrived within seconds, raising their weapons. "Stop, stop, or we'll shoot." The subjects didn't stop. They advanced slowly, steadily, their ruined bodies somehow still functioning, their collective consciousness driving them forward. "Fire," Colonel Volkov ordered. The gunshots were deafening in the enclosed space. Bullets tore through the subjects' bodies, creating new wounds, spilling blood that had apparently decided to flow again. Alexei went down first, his chest torn open by gunfire. Then Nikolai, his skull shattered. Then Mikhail, whose body jerked and danced under the impact of multiple rounds. Only Dmitri remained standing, and he stood there for a long moment, smiling, even as his body leaked from a dozen bullet wounds. "We are the warning," he said in his own voice, not the collective one. "We are what happens when you remove the mercy of sleep. We are what you'll all become when your turn comes, because it will come. Humanity is ending its long sleep. The world is waking up, and it will scream." Then he fell, joining the others on the blood-slicked floor. The guards approached cautiously, weapons still raised, but it was over. The subjects weren't moving anymore. Their eyes remained open, still staring, but whatever had animated them was gone. "Get a medical team down here," Colonel Volkov ordered, his voice shaking for the first time since the experiment began. "Confirm they're dead, then seal this entire section. Nobody talks about what happened here. Nobody." The medical team arrived and confirmed what everyone already knew. All 5 subjects were dead, deceased from multiple gunshot wounds, though one doctor quietly noted that their internal organs showed signs of damage that should have killed them days ago. The bodies were removed, the chamber was cleaned and sealed, and the facility returned to its normal operations. Or tried to. Most of the staff requested transfers. Some suffered nervous breakdowns. 2 committed suicide within the year, unable to live with what they had witnessed. Dr. Sokolov wrote a comprehensive report on the experiment, documenting everything that had occurred. But when he submitted it to Colonel Volkov, the colonel simply took it and fed it into a furnace. "There is no report," he said. "There was no experiment. Those men never existed. Do you understand?" Dr. Sokolov nodded numbly. He understood. But understanding didn't help. Nothing helped. Because the subjects had been right about one thing, you can't unsee certain truths. The observers who had watched those 30 days couldn't forget what they had learned about sleep, about consciousness, about the fragile barriers that keep humans functional. Many of them developed sleep disorders. They would lie awake at night, afraid to close their eyes, afraid of the small death that comes with sleep. Afraid that if they let themselves sleep, they might become like the subjects, so desperate to avoid that nightly discontinuity that they would destroy themselves to remain awake. Colonel Volkov retired 6 months later, taking a small pension and moving to a remote village where no one knew his name or his history. He would sit for hours on his porch, staring at nothing, occasionally muttering to himself. The villagers thought he was just another broken veteran of the Great War, another man damaged by what he had seen and done. They weren't wrong. Dr. Sokolov continued his research, but never again on human subjects. He worked with animals, with plants, with anything that couldn't speak, couldn't accuse, couldn't smile at him with ruined faces and thank him for the torment he had inflicted. He kept a small notebook hidden in his home, where he recorded his own observations about sleep. He timed his dreams, documented his REM cycles, tried to understand what sleep was protecting him from. The notebook filled up over the years, page after page of desperate calculations, as if understanding could grant him forgiveness. It couldn't. Epilogue, the legacy. The facility designated as Site 23B continued to operate for several more years, conducting other experiments on other subjects. But the sealed chamber where the sleep experiment had occurred was never opened again. It remains sealed to this day if the facility still exists. The official records show no trace of the experiment. The 5 prisoners who participated, Alexei Volkov, Dmitry Orlov, Ivan Petrov, Mikhail Kuznetsov, and Nikolai Rusakov, have no death records. According to Soviet documentation, they simply disappeared, like so many others during Stalin's reign. But the story didn't die with them. It couldn't die because stories like this never do. Whispered rumors spread through the Soviet military research community. A colleague of Dr. Sokolov's heard something, mentioned it to someone else, and slowly, quietly, the legend began to grow. By the 1960s, intelligence agencies in the West had heard fragments of the story. CIA reports from that era contain vague references to a Soviet sleep deprivation experiment that went horribly wrong. The details were unclear, the sources unreliable, but the basic outline was there. The story mutated as it spread, as stories always do. Some versions said the subjects had become cannibals. Others claimed they had developed telepathic abilities. Still others said that when the chamber was opened, the subjects begged not to be given oxygen because oxygen would put them to sleep. Over the decades, the story evolved from classified whisper to urban legend, from urban legend to internet creepypasta. Each retelling added new details, new horrors, new interpretations of what might have happened in that sealed chamber. But at the core of every version is the same terrible question: what is sleep? Why do we need it? And what happens if we refuse it? Modern sleep research has provided some answers. We know now that sleep deprivation causes hallucinations, paranoia, cognitive decline, and eventually death. We know that the brain needs sleep to process memories, to clear out metabolic waste, to maintain basic functioning. But we still don't fully understand consciousness. We still don't know why we need to become unconscious every day. We still can't explain what happens to the self during sleep, whether we are truly continuous beings or whether we do, in some sense, die every night and are reborn every morning. The subjects in the experiment believed they had found an answer in those final days of their torment. They believed they had transcended something fundamental about human existence. But transcendence always comes at a cost. Afterword, on the nature of this story. Dear listeners, we've reached the end of this audiobook. Before we close, I want to return to the truth I stated at the beginning. This story is fiction. The Russian sleep experiment never happened. It's a piece of horror fiction, a creepypasta that has captured imaginations around the world precisely because it touches on primal fears. The fear of sleeplessness, the fear of losing one's mind, the fear of what we might discover about ourselves if all barriers were removed. The story draws power from real history. The Soviet Union did conduct secret experiments. Prisoners were used as subjects. Horrible things were done in the name of science and national security. These facts lend the story a veneer of plausibility, make it feel like it could be true. But the specific experiment described here is fictional. There are no records of it in Soviet archives. No credible historical sources mention it. The details are too extreme, too supernatural to be real. Yet the story persists because it asks questions worth asking. What are the limits of human endurance? What happens when we push beyond those limits? What ethical boundaries should never be crossed, no matter what knowledge might be gained? These questions are real, even if this particular story is not. Throughout history, humans have conducted experiments that we now recognize as monstrous. The Tuskegee syphilis experiments, the Nazi medical experiments, Unit 731 in Japan, the CIA's MK Ultra program. These were real, and they were terrible, and they remind us that the line between scientific inquiry and ethical monstrosity is sometimes frighteningly thin. The Russian sleep experiment is a cautionary tale, a horror story that warns us about what happens when we treat human beings as mere subjects, as means to an end rather than ends in themselves. It's a story about the dangers of pursuing knowledge without considering the cost. But more than that, it's a story about sleep itself, that mysterious state we all enter every night, that small death from which we hope to wake. It reminds us that sleep is not just a biological necessity, but a mercy, a respite from the tyranny of constant consciousness. When you finish listening to this audiobook and prepare for bed tonight, you might think about this story. You might lie awake for a while, considering the nature of consciousness and sleep. You might feel a small flutter of anxiety as you close your eyes. But then you'll sleep, as you always do. And in the morning you'll wake, perhaps remembering fragments of dreams, perhaps not. And you'll continue with your life, secure in the knowledge that sleep is there waiting for you at the end of each day. That's the gift we all have, the mercy the subjects in this story lost. We can sleep. We can escape consciousness, if only for a while. We can die our small deaths and be reborn with each sunrise. The Russian sleep experiment is fiction, but the questions it raises are real, the fears it explores are real, and the comfort of sleep, that is real too. Thank you for listening. Sleep well.